The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the open field where the horses grazed. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh grass and earth. The peaceful serenity of the rural farm was interrupted by an unexpected sound, a frantic whinnying. Storm, a powerful and intelligent stallion, raised his head, his ears pricked in alert. He turned his gaze toward the edge of the pasture, where a faint rustling noise came from behind a cluster of trees. It wasn't like the usual sounds of the farm. No rustling leaves or wind through the branches. This was something different. With a snort, Storm broke into a gallop, his hooves pounding the soft earth as he raced toward the source of the sound. His owner, Maria, watched from a distance, puzzled by the horse's sudden rush. She had known Storm for years and had never seen him behave quite like this. "Storm, what's gotten into you?" Maria called out, but the horse was already too far ahead, driven by an instinct that Maria couldn't understand. The dense trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing near the edge of the farm. Storm skidded to a halt, his breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. His nostrils flared as he sniffed the air, and his eyes locked onto something on the ground. In the middle of the clearing, nestled among some bushes, was an old, weathered cardboard box. It was out of place here in the quiet wilderness, foreign, abandoned. The moment Storm set his gaze upon it, his body stiffened, and he let out a series of concerned whinnies, as if trying to warn whoever was nearby. Maria arrived moments later, breathless from running after her horse. Her eyes followed Storm's gaze, and the sight of the box stopped her in her tracks. Her mind raced. What could possibly be in a box in the middle of nowhere? As she approached, her heart began to pound in her chest. With hesitant steps, she neared the box and slowly knelt down. She opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. There, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket, was a baby, an infant, no more than a few months old, lying motionless and alone. Maria's hand trembled as she reached for the child, her heart aching. The baby was still breathing, but barely. A deep sense of panic gripped her chest as she checked for any signs of life. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell, but its skin was pale, and its lips were tinged blue. The urgency of the situation hit her hard. What kind of person could leave a child like this in the middle of the woods with no one to care for it? Maria felt a surge of anger, but it was overshadowed by her overwhelming need to act fast. She scooped the baby up gently in her arms and stood, looking desperately at Storm. Storm, as if sensing her distress, nudged her with his head as though to remind her that she wasn't alone. His eyes were soft, but full of concern. Maria looked into his eyes, and without thinking, turned toward the barn. She had to get the baby help, immediately. Storm trotted alongside her, his presence reassuring, as if he understood the urgency of the situation. The barn was only a short walk away, but it felt like an eternity as Maria's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who could have done this, and why? The questions swirled in her head, but there was no time for answers now. All that mattered was getting the baby help. Storm led the way, guiding Maria through the familiar path to the barn. As they reached the wooden door, Maria burst inside, yelling for her husband. "James, James, we need help!" Her husband rushed to her side, his eyes widening as he saw the baby in her arms. "What happened? Is the baby okay?" "I don't know," Maria gasped. "I found it in a box, abandoned in the woods. It's barely breathing." James's face went pale as he quickly moved to help. "Get the first aid kit," I'll call 911. Maria placed the baby on the nearby table, her hands shaking as she tried to assess its condition. She looked to Storm, who stood by her side, watching, with his deep, trusting eyes. In that moment, she realized that Storm had led her to this moment. The horse had brought her to safety, and now together, they would fight to save the life of the baby who had no one else. Maria's hands were shaking as she held the baby, now wrapped in a soft blanket, lying on the table. The harsh reality of the situation hung heavily in the air, but there was no time for tears. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell, but the breaths were shallow, each one slower than the last. Storm stood by the door of the barn, his large body still and silent, but his presence was comforting. His deep, knowing eyes watched Maria with quiet concern, as though he understood just how critical the situation was. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the horse had brought them to the baby for a reason. James rushed into the barn with the first aid kit, his face pale but focused. He quickly took control, setting up a small area by the workbench and placing the baby gently onto a soft blanket. Maria stood back, allowing her husband to work, but her mind was still racing. How had this happened? Why had the baby been left in the woods like this? Was there anyone who cared for this child, or had it been abandoned by someone with no regard for its life? James worked quickly, checking the baby's vitals, applying some warm cloths to help with circulation. "We need to keep the baby warm, Maria," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We have to stay calm." Maria nodded, biting her lip, fighting back the overwhelming wave of emotion that threatened to crash over her. This baby needed help, and they had to act fast. She wiped the tears from her eyes, focusing all her energy on what needed to be done. James had already called 911, but the moments stretched on as they waited for help to arrive. It felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been minutes. The baby's tiny body was so frail, and Maria kept her eyes trained on it, willing it to keep breathing. Storm, however, remained calm. He moved closer to the table, standing by Maria's side as if offering silent support. His presence was a source of strength for her, and she ran her hand over his soft fur, grateful for his unwavering loyalty. Suddenly, the door to the barn burst open, and two paramedics entered, swiftly assessing the situation. One of them was a tall, quiet man, while the other, a woman with dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail, quickly moved to the baby's side. "Can you tell us what happened?" the woman asked, her voice kind, yet urgent. "I found the baby in a box out in the woods," Maria explained, her voice shaky but clear. "Storm led me to it. He wouldn't stop barking until I went to investigate. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just leave it there." The paramedics nodded, their training kicking in as they gently checked the baby's breathing and temperature. Maria's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that the baby was now in capable hands. After a few minutes of careful assessment, the woman turned to Maria. "The baby's vital signs are stable now," she said. "We need to take him to the hospital right away, but it looks like he's going to be okay. He's lucky you found him when you did." Maria exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sank down onto a nearby crate, her body finally allowing itself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. She glanced at Storm, who stood by her side, his eyes soft and reassuring. The horse had saved this baby's life in ways she could never fully understand. The paramedics carefully transferred the baby onto a stretcher, securing him for transport. As they moved toward the door, the woman gave Storm a brief look of acknowledgement. "Looks like your horse is a hero," she said with a small smile. Maria smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with gratitude. Storm had indeed led her to the baby, had guided her in a way only he could understand. It wasn't just a chance encounter, it was fate. By the time they reached the hospital, the baby was doing much better. The doctors were hopeful, and Maria couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief. She had saved the baby, but it was Storm's courage and intuition that had made it possible. Days passed, and the baby, now named Liam, began to show signs of recovery. Maria and James were there every step of the way, ready to give this child a new home filled with love. The bond between them was already formed, but it was the bond between Maria, James, and Storm that had made all of this possible. They didn't know who had left Liam in the woods or why, but they knew one thing for certain. The baby had found a family. And as for Storm, well, he had found a place not just as a protector, but as a hero who had helped guide the way.